Bienvenidos a Trading Risk and Beyond. Soy Gerardo Herrera, su anfitrión. En esta ocasión continuamos con la discusión que comenzamos en el anterior programa sobre el marco regulatorio ¿realmente ayuda? Nuevamente, Ronald, Elizabeth Ritter y Gary DeWaal nos acompañan para discutir las implicaciones que estas leyes tendrán para México, Latinoamérica, volumen, eficiencia, etc. Acompáñenme y veamos este encuentro de opiniones con nuestros tres invitados.
Now let's bring us into where we are today, Mexico, and other countries like Mexico. To me, they are in a great position to come up with their laws and regulations, taking bits, pieces, understand what the good parts were, making sure they don't adopt the bad parts or the ineffective regulatory laws or regulations. And I think many countries like Mexico are in a wonderful position to come up with and develop and establish a legal regulatory system that's going to be more effective. And to me, regulation is not effective, it's bad regulation. We need effective regulation. We just don't need regulation for the sake of regulation. And I'm not saying what we did in the U.S. is not effective. I think it is, but I think there's going to be a need to sit back 6 months from now, a year from now, and look back and say, do we need to make some minor modifications, tweak it if you want to call it, and to make it a bit more effective set of laws and regulations. And Congress is going through that now. They're looking at possible amendments to the Commodity Exchange Act to change it. It would be interesting to see what changes might occur. We have a new regime at the CFTC, got 3 new leaders there, a new chairman and 2 new commissioners. It just started in the last couple of weeks. They may have a different approach than the prior group of 5 commissioners who brought forward all these regulations. So I think that we're in very interesting times. I don't know exactly what the end picture is going to be, but I think we're in very interesting times at this point.
I think to a certain extent, as Ronald has suggested, you control your own destiny. Because again, I do think the global regime will ultimately be to defer to local jurisdictions' rules and regulations, again, to the extent the magic words are as comprehensive or are as comprehensive and effective as the other jurisdictions. So I think that if you take Ron's advice, if Mexico takes Ron's advice and enacts laws that make sense for the Mexican economy, for the Mexican businesses, and they address the general commitments of the G20, if they satisfy the OSCO broad guidelines, then I think you're going to have something workable that will make not only Mexico attractive location for international counterparties to do business with, but for international counterparties to host business with Mexican counterparties. Okay, so again, I agree wholeheartedly with Ron that to a certain extent you control your own destiny at this point. The problem is if there's no action, if there's not the adoption of comparable and comprehensive legislation, then you will end up defaulting to all the other countries' rules and regulations. And in that case, that could be very detrimental to the Mexican economy. Okay, so it's very, very important that the law and legal structure comes into place as quickly as possible so there can be mutual recognition, there can be substituted compliance, and business into Mexico and business out of Mexico goes on as freely tomorrow as it can today.
Let me just follow on that. I think there absolutely is a critically important time opportunity here. If this doesn't happen, and happen in a certain time frame, there is a great opportunity loss. Because just as you said, there is the possibility of defaulting to other regimes and losing business. If Mexico can get this in place and get the substituted compliance regimes in place with EMIR, with the United States, I think it becomes a very attractive venue for business to burgeon here, to say, come here, do business here. And again, I've been saying this over and over again, there are 6 now, there are only 6 in the world. There's no reason Mexico can't be 7. Come do business here. And it becomes, you make yourself a very attractive venue for doing worldwide global business.
We have only one regulator in Mexico, as you know. We don't have two regulators or any prospect of having more than one regulator in Mexico. There has been a lot of discussion in the US about the convenience of merging these two regulators so that the US financial system has one mind. What is the likelihood of that happening? And what would be the consequences for countries like Mexico having one single regulator on the other side of the border?
In my opinion, the likelihood of that happening is very low. I think that given the history of the rationale why there are two federal independent agencies, how that happened, the CFTC, of course, grew up under the auspices of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the SEC grew up under the auspices of the Senate Banking Committee. So the Senate Agriculture Committee oversees the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Senate Banking Committee oversees the SEC. You started this question by saying the SEC says this, the CFTC says this, they argue with each other. I don't like to think of it as arguing. It's familial bantering. Obviously there are jurisdictional issues. The SEC answers to the Senate Banking, the CFTC answers to the Ag Committee. Those jurisdictional issues that neither committee wants to give up oversight. And there are obvious reasons why they don't want to give up that oversight. I cannot see that happening.
There's a paragraph in Tim Geithner's new book where he reveals that right after the financial crisis, when the beginnings of Dodd-Frank were beginning to discuss down in the Hill, the issue of merger came up because the theory was that was the best time. You had a Democratic legislator, you had a Democratic president, this was the time. And the problem is that Barney Frank says, no, it just won't happen. It just won't happen because of the politics that Liz has just talked about.
I have been working at the CFTC for 25 years. This issue has come up with every single president, every administration, it's not, I will just say, in my lifetime, I can't imagine it happening.
Would you guys recommend countries like Mexico to have more than one regulator?
I would not.
No.
I mean,
okay, well, you finally
we all agree again.
Well, remember now, it's just not the CFTC and the SEC, because all the financial institutions fall under a category called bank holding company. And once you're a bank, the Fed and other the Treasury and other banking regulators come into play and play an equal role. So even if you hypothetically have this merger, it won't occur in my lifetime, maybe others, you still got other regulators in the U.S. that play a very important role in how financial institutions and how financial products are going to be sold and regulated. So.
Well, from this side of the border, it looks complex. From this side, it really looks
complex.
like
It looks complex from that side, too. Don't worry about that.
I think we're all in agreement why Mexico should not add.
No.
There's another important reason why, if you are a country that can consolidate your financial regulatory affairs into one agency, when we have the multiple agency approach in the U.S., I don't care what they say, they don't communicate with each other. So one agency can go in and regulate XYZ Bank, and another agency can come in and regulate XYZ Bank, and while they always were, the system is designed for them to work together or share that information, it doesn't work. When you have one agency like you have here, you might have underlying divisions within that agency or different units within that agency, but hopefully the head of the agency encourages communication, sharing of information among the various units, and then you can therefore make a better informed decision with all the information or data that you need regarding that firm or that situation or that product. We don't really have that proper, effective connection.
It absolutely
In the-
makes it easier to share information.
Right.
Well, after all, many of the critics of big government knows that whenever government finds a problem that they cannot solve, they come up with a new agency
Exactly.
to solve it. So probably you need an agency that helps agencies communicate with each other, you know?
And that was the embarrassment of FSOC. Rather than merge the two agencies, they just created an agency over on
That was
top of
the
that.
idea.
Si hablamos de más leyes, de más requerimientos, de más compliance, ¿qué impacto tendrá esto sobre volumen y rentabilidad? Y eso podrá afectar a los consumidores de los servicios financieros. Vamos a ver qué es lo que nuestros invitados tienen que decir al respecto. Y también, ¿qué podemos esperar hacia el futuro? ¿Habrá cada vez más regulaciones o habrá una flexibilización del marco regulatorio? Volume and liquidity. What can we expect in the next decade?
So I think the gross numbers are going to remain and stay, but I mean, I think from a netting perspective, you're going to, I mean, if you look at that number and try to compare it to the 600 trillion, the $600 trillion number is going to come down considerably. It still might be 600 trillion of gross, but it may be a much smaller number on a net clear type world. Once we get to the 100% cleared world, we're not there yet. So I think it takes time before we can answer that question.
And my concern is, I can't predict it either, but something that Elizabeth alluded to earlier, the most critical matter in this whole process, will folks who need to bona fide hedge still feel comfortable hedging? Because whether the overall gross number remains the same, increases, decreases, to me, that's not as relevant as whether the current regulations drive out folks with bona fide hedging needs.
Exactly right.
If that happens, then it doesn't make a difference. Then we're talking about just speculators and we're talking about markets that don't make sense. Where the real tuning has to be around not just non-financial institutions, but financial institutions that are in the markets for bona fide hedging needs. If the needs of these folks are not addressed, and there's still some fine-tuning that needs to be done, I think we're going to have an issue.
I think that's correct.
Agree.
I think there's great frustration over the increased costs in compliance. There's no doubt that the compliance costs have dramatically increased. And I think time will tell on a cost-benefit analysis if, in fact, the world is safer and counterparty exposure and market risk is somehow diminished as a result of this process, then probably the investment is worthwhile. But there's no doubt in the short term, this has been a very painful process. Right now, in the United States, a lot of the regulations are, at least on the CFTC side, are finalized. There's still some big ones out there. So there's some certainty and people can make planning. But, you know, the original expectations have been met. There was expectations that 200 or 300 folks would register as swap dealers. That hasn't happened. There was expectations that 100 people would register as major swap participants. The number has been 2 or 3. There was expectation that lots of folks would register as swap execution facilities. That hasn't happened either. So, you know, again, time will tell. But there's no doubt there's been great frustration, one, at the cost, and two, at the uncertainty. You have to also keep in mind the wild card in all this. The CFTC has a tremendous new law to administer. It's got tremendous number of regulations to deal with. And the U.S. Congress has not appreciably increased the budget of the CFTC. So individual companies that want to get relief or get clarification, it's an ordeal. And it's not because the staff isn't hardworking. There just isn't enough staff, and there isn't enough hours in the day. So I think the cost and the frustration around this has really somewhat, you know, detrimentally impacted the buy side.
And just keep in mind, as we have discussed, Dodd-Frank requires 398 new regulations. Only 208 have been finalized. 190 are still out there. So this is a ever-changing regulatory landscape. And so we don't know yet what the true or final set of rules or regulations are going to be. And until we see that total picture, it's going to be really hard to assess the economic cost. But I agree with Gary, the cost to comply to date have been tremendous. And as an educator, I am a big, strong believer in educating the industry, or in this case, the financial industry. And I think RiskMetrics is doing a tremendous job in playing that role here in Mexico for the conference we're at now. But I also know they provide these programs in other countries. We need more programs like that to educate the industry as well as the consuming public.
I have to say that what's most impressed me is the quality of the questions and the responses of the audience. You can see that there's an engagement here, and there's a real wanting to discuss and move forward the Mexican economy to adapt locally standards that are ultimately, comparable and comprehensive. And I think that Riskmathic's bringing together important people, important decision makers, government officials in a forum to learn about other alternatives, to learn about different methods, and to come up with their own views. That's just not only a fantastic process, it's an exciting process, and you guys get a lot of credit for bringing that together.
This has been a wonderful experience, and I too am an educator. I teach at Georgetown Law School, and I have been equally impressed with what I see, the synergy between the speakers and the people who are asking the questions and listening and taking notes.
Nadie tiene duda de que el sistema financiero, para cumplir su objetivo con la sociedad, requiere un marco regulatorio adecuado. Pero sí hay muchas dudas sobre si el actual marco regulatorio y las nuevas leyes que se están emitiendo alrededor del mundo contribuirán a ello. Soy Gerardo Herrera, su anfitrión. Les agradezco habernos acompañado y le invito a que nos acompañe en otros programas de temas de relevancia y actualidad para el sector financiero en siguientes ediciones. Gracias.